Welcome to Japan Unleashed. Welcome back to episode 2 of Japan Unleashed, where we take a deep look into important issues facing Japan. I'm your host, Parker Allen, President and CEO of Parthenon Japan. Today's episode of Japan Unleashed is the second in a 6-episode series on Japan's regional revitalization. The topic of our discussion today is Japan's real estate realities. What are the current realities in the Japanese real estate industry? How has that made living in rural communities an unattractive option? Can the Japanese government do something to get more people to purchase property and perhaps even move to the Japanese countryside? We're going to try and answer some of these questions today. I am joined today by my good friend, fellow Japan specialist, Parthenon Japan senior advisor, and co-contributor to this series, David Wagner. David, thank you so much for being a part of this program today.
Thanks, Parker. It's going to be a fun discussion. Should be interesting. And real estate is honestly at the core of Japan's rural revitalization challenge as a whole.
David and I, being lifelong learners of Japan, share a passion for the many issues that Japan faces. We deeply care about this country as foreign but long-term permanent residents who call this country home.
Yeah, and those familiar with Japan's policy landscape are probably well-versed on the topic of regional revitalization as a whole, which has been a buzzword of sorts for over a decade. I think in this episode, we discuss Japan's rural real estate sector and the role it can play in revitalizing Japan's economy.
All right, let's start off with a basic discussion about some of the main problems with housing in rural Japan. First off, we need to touch on Japan's aging society, which of course is directly connected to the shrinking population. As the Japanese population ages and young people move to urban areas for work and education, the demand for housing in rural areas obviously decreases, leading to a decline in the housing market.
Yeah, it's not a new problem, but it's a festering one. Estimates vary, but concluding the same thing. Unless something is done on a concerted level, Japan's abandoned home problem will only get worse in the future. Parker, what's your view on that?
And Japan's abandoned home problem is something that I have become somewhat of a pundit on. 3 years ago, as a sort of independent subdivision of Parthenon Japan, we created a crazy consulting service called Akiya and Inaka, where we help foreigners and now Japanese people as well investigate and consider real estate options in the Japanese countryside. And in doing this, I have a first-person view of what's going on. And it's not pretty.
Well, the numbers are what? The published numbers are 8 million empty homes around Japan, right?
And those are the published numbers. You look anywhere outside of major metro areas and you are certain to see a lot of abandoned homes, businesses, former stores.
But it's also in urban areas like Tokyo and Osaka, right?
You see them, but of course, with that land having a certain value, the volume is much different. And when you talk about abandoned houses in a rural community, you have to think about the sheer reality that there's a limited population in the first place. And if you're living in one of these communities, and let's say half of the properties in your community are abandoned, how's that going to make you feel?
Well, forget about feelings. How's that going to pay for itself? I mean,
how's that going to affect your home value?
How are you going to repave roads and pay for sewage systems and pay for schools? And it's an endless list, right?
And it's extremely unsustainable. I mean, it's a somewhat open secret that essentially the economic engine of Japan's economic powerhouses, of course, then tax revenue, and then, of course, the Bank of Japan's yen-making machines going whir, 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 It's become a bit of a Twitter meme. But that sort of combination is bankrolling a lot of these rural communities, which are facing a deficit by and large.
I mean, in a future podcast, we're going to talk in more detail about some regional efforts and some local efforts, but it's not like they're asleep at the wheel doing nothing. It's just that the problem is massive. It's on an epic scale.
And, of course, there's economics involved. I mean, another point is just the lack of affordable housing. The cost of building new houses in rural areas is high. Of course, building a house anywhere in Japan honestly costs about the same. And many rural residents cannot afford to buy or rent these houses.
But this is the same in many parts of the world. So what's so different about Japan?
I think it's the fact that while we have all of these abandoned houses, which could potentially be renovated and turned into cheap, easy to live in accommodation and places to live for people who, for instance, can't buy a brand new house or don't want to for whatever reason, they don't. And there's a whole mindset around this, which I'll get into later, but it's complicated.
As are all things.
Then, of course, there's a lack of infrastructure and services. Many rural areas lack basic or sufficient transportation, healthcare, and internet access in some situations, making it difficult for people to live and work in these areas.
Yeah, but again, this is nothing really unique to Japan. Is there more beneath the surface here?
Actually, when it comes to transportation, it's not a problem of a lack of transportation. It's a lack of fast transportation. A lot of the rural communities in Japan are served by buses. Buses are not fast. And if you live in a community where it's a 20-minute bus ride to get to a station, and you've got to ride into Tokyo and it takes an hour and a half or 2 hours, that total transit time, including the walk to your office, you're looking at 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, who can do that? I mean, places like Atami, which are roughly, less than an hour away from central Tokyo, are more appealing. You get the ocean, you get the mountains, and you don't have to commute more than you probably would if you lived in Tokyo proper.
Exactly. But that's, of course, if you live in a condo right in front of Atami Station. Atami's a big city, and a lot of the best views are had in places that aren't so close to the station. So unless, of course, you are wealthy and can take a taxi or pay for a parking space at the station, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But when it comes to internet, actually, you would be surprised that even the most rural and remote areas in Japan have high-speed fiber optic internet. And I have had many situations where I have thought, there is no way on earth that this place in the middle of nowhere on top of a freaking mountain has fiber optic internet.
And yet it does.
It did. And we got it. And it's faster than it is in Tokyo, actually, because there's less demand, obviously. But internet is actually something that Japan did really good with. The transportation issue, of course, is more complicated because living in rural areas means using cars, which, of course, the majority of still use gasoline.
But even the train system, there's fewer and fewer trains that come. There used to be let's say 6 an hour. Now there's 4 or something like that. And a lot of the train stations aren't even staffed or manned with train employees. It's all based on the honor system now. So everything's really getting hollowed out.
Yeah, and there's even talk of some train lines potentially stopping service just because of the lack of demand. If they're running in the red, why keep doing it? And this is a very sad problem, but it's just continuing to add on to the laundry list of problems facing
Well, one of
Japan's
them
rural
is
areas.
lack of job opportunities, right?
And if you can't get a house, or even if you can get a house, if you can't get a job, how are you going to pay for the house?
Well, it's difficult to afford housing to begin with, and then the decline makes it even worse. I think the cycle feeds on itself. The more the population ages and declines, the fewer jobs that are available, which impacts families and livelihoods and cities and regions as a whole, right?
Yeah, talking about job opportunities, I mean, we can't forget the general lack of job opportunities in many rural areas, which makes it difficult for people to afford housing. And natural disasters don't help things either. Rural areas are more susceptible to natural disasters such as earthquakes, typhoons, and landslides, which can damage or destroy housing and make it difficult to rebuild.
Well, Tohoku in the Fukushima crisis of 2011 shows that in a big way. After all, who wants to live in an earthquake zone that's prone to tsunami?
And it's really sad because, especially along the Sanriku coast, once vibrant communities are now just this empty network of roads with nothing there. Brand new roads, infrastructure is there, but people are afraid to move back because it was 10 years ago, but it was only 10 years ago, and every time there's an earthquake, it's just in the back of people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the issue of depopulation and government initiatives in a future podcast about this in more detail, but it is a huge problem.
I will say, though, not all rural areas are that disaster prone. And in fact, when it comes to disaster preparedness and also your vulnerability to natural disasters, especially earthquakes, being in a large metro area like Tokyo or Osaka, if we have a serious earthquake, like think Kobe 1995, things are not going to be good.
Well, supply chains will stop. Roads are buckled. Pipes are broken. It's going to be the same anywhere. And we saw that massive earthquake, 2 earthquakes in Turkey as the time of this recording. It was yesterday. It's devastating. On whether you're in the rural areas or the urban areas, supply chains are going to get cut.
I will say, though, fun fact, around the mountains, it's well known among geologists and other people who study rocks that the earth is stronger. And so these areas...
Earth is stronger than what?
Stronger than it is towards the coast. So, for instance, I have a place in rural Saitama, and when there's an earthquake, it shakes less than it would in Tokyo because the terra firma is terra firmer.
Well, that's what they say. For example, in the Tokyo area where we are, that Chiba is one of the places you don't want to be because it's a lot of the reclaimed land, right? You want to be along the Chuo line where it's nice and solid earth. Yeah, that's what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. And that's why prices along the Chuo line continue to skyrocket.
And why they don't in Chiba. Fun fact.
Not so fun for the Chiba prefectural government, though. And of course, there is a general lack of government support. More could be done.
I wonder how true that is, especially in the historical light of rural areas supporting Japan's Liberal Democratic Party with votes. The money flows back with projects. Am I wrong about that, Parker?
You're definitely not wrong about that, but infrastructure and getting people to move to the countryside are two different things. So what has happened, especially in recent years, is I don't want to call them roads to nowhere because Japan is actually continuing to build amazing transport infrastructure networks among severely difficult to access parts of Japan, which can lead to rural revitalization as that opens new logistics opportunities. It opens up, faster transport times between rural areas and metropolitan areas. And of course, we can't forget about tourism. The faster you can get from an airport to an accommodation, the more likely it is that people will stay there. So the infrastructure part is actually being handled very well, but the real estate part, this is like, I don't want to say it's not being touched because there are initiatives, but it's just not enough.
No, it's not enough. And incentives is a key concept across the board here. Investing in rural areas, what's the incentive? Japan plans to establish new zones and simplify procedures for repurposing vacant homes in an effort to utilize the growing number of uninhabited properties across the country. We know this, right? But what's the incentive for a lot of people? If you're a young family, do they have the proper education facilities? Do they have nursing care? Do they have nursing homes for your parents? I mean, they're massive issues, right? Where's the incentive?
Well, it really depends on the area. I think there are some communities that you would be surprised have plentiful resources and really good schools, actually. However, when push comes to shove, people have gotten used to living in the big city, and it's ingrained in the social consciousness. I think in our first episode, I touched on how, in Japan's rapid growth period, popular media was all about the big city life. And even today, you look at, any drama or TV program, and you'll see the occasional TV show about something in some rural area, but it's always treated as this, oh, let's go on a weekend trip here and see what's out here. It's never, actually focused on rural areas. Everything is Tokyo or Osaka.
It's an infrastructure issue at the end of the day. And I think, to Japan's defense, they are creating repurposed development zones. I think there's 100 of them now. So they're doing things, but the question is the pace. And how might the government address the pace of redevelopment and development? And how might the government simultaneously address the issue of aging and shrinking population? It's a complicated topic.
Yeah, and that's really where, how much can we, of course, lean on the government to solve this problem? I think people expect the government to do something about it because they've said they're going to do something about it, but the government can't force people to move to the countryside.
But we can ask the question what the government can do to help develop local economies in rural areas. And I think one issue would be to further simplify the classification of vacant houses as ready for demolition. You can probably comment on this.
Yeah, and that's a huge issue, is a lot of these abandoned houses, nobody knows who owns them. And, local governments try to figure it out, and oftentimes the registrations are in arrears, and perhaps the registered owner has passed away. Then you've got to try and find the descendants and see if they want to take over the property, and usually the answer is no. And then you have to assert an ownership. Are they going to relinquish ownership to the local government and allow it to demolish the property, or what's going to happen? I mean, is it a lack of regulations? Because regulations vary. I mean, many localities go through a classification process based on the degree of urgency. And this needs to be widened beyond disaster prioritization. For example, in many areas, vacant homes at risk of collapsing are currently ineligible for preferential treatment. Yeah, and that's another huge problem because, I love abandoned houses, and I've sort of made it my life's mission for whatever reason to get more people interested in the subject, because a lot of these houses, they might have been empty for a few years, but they're prime candidates for revitalization. That's not the case with a lot of abandoned houses, though. Honestly, it's only a select few. I would say, 90+% of the abandoned houses are teardowns. But the problem is, tearing down houses costs money.
Well, again, it comes back to incentives to attract people to move to rural areas and invest in rural areas. Tax credits are needed. Subsidies for new housing developments are an obvious place to go.
And of course, that's where that sort of public-private partnership is going to become key. Because without stronger ties between the national government, local governments, these small towns and villages and local stakeholders, there has to be some sort of concerted effort around fixing this problem.
And a big one, as we talked about earlier, was making sure there are enough job opportunities for people of all ages to work in rural areas. And I'm doing some research for a future piece, a thought leadership piece that accompanies this series on women leaving rural areas, men leaving rural areas, as well as urban young families being incentivized to go to rural areas, right? It's a very complicated issue.
Yeah, and it's another thing that has been widely covered in the media. When it comes to the idea of families moving to rural areas, one big thing that people don't talk about enough is age. I mean, if you've got an infant or a child who has not entered school yet, moving to a rural area might be one option because they can start school in that community and be part of that community.
Well, there's that issue, but then there's the farmer issue, agriculture issue. Aging farmers, want to rent out their land to young farmers through a lease system, which exists, and passing on their farming know-how to the next generation as a whole. We know that a lot of farmers are marrying, for example, Filipino women in some of these rural areas, which is another interesting facet of it all. And then there's the issue of supporting development and incentivizing rural areas through just having tourists come and take a look. Maybe you can comment on the issue of foreigners investing in real estate in Japan.
No, I think that this is something that could make a real change in rural real estate in Japan because I have to say it, Japanese people have a lot of emotional baggage with the idea of living in the countryside. And
positive or negative?
It's negative overwhelmingly. And it's because of media. It's because of this idea that living in the big city, working at a big company, and doing all of the fun things and shopping and, being sort of part of this, economic powerhouse, it means something. It's like a status symbol for people. And even people in rural areas, school-aged people, a lot of them are watching these things on TV. They're reading about things on the internet. They want to go see that. They want to experience it. And it just entices them. And so a lot of them who are really passionate about wanting to get out of this rural area that's full of old people want to go to college in Tokyo.
Can't blame them. And, we see these rural areas dotted across the country with just aged population, right? They're dying off. And these cities and rural areas, towns, villages are in real trouble. Parker, in your work, and I'm not creating an advertorial here, but just I'm curious, in your work with helping people find homes, my sense is, compared to 3 years ago and going through the COVID period, that Japan's really coming into a fast-paced desire to have people buy property. More foreigners are interested in buying property, and the prices are up now, right?
Yes, prices are going up, and it's interesting. Prices are going up, especially in the low range,
under 20 million yen?
Under 10 million yen, honestly. So I think a lot more people and companies as well are being adventurous with rural areas, especially those with some level of proximity to Tokyo. On the other hand, rural areas that aren't so close to metro areas are not seeing that same uptick. So there's a big disparity there, which can't be helped under the current regime. And that's why really there needs to be this public-private partnership. And also what's going to happen with the future of work. Around the world, people are moving to hybrid models or remote models. Japan has overwhelmingly kind of gone back to the office while
if you don't offer the hybrid model, a lot of these companies, young people won't stay. it's a permanent change even in Japan. Yes, Japanese prefer more face-to-face business, and they like to come back to the office. A lot of people prefer the office to their home because their home is like 3 feet wide. But on the flip side, I work for a lot of companies, and I can see that if they tell me flat out, if we don't offer the hybrid model, we're going to lose workers.
That is absolutely true, especially global companies who want to attract top talent. The whole hybrid model or even remote options, if you don't offer those options, you're not going to have access to the same talent
And
pool.
I think we can transfer that idea of not offering options. If you don't offer options to people looking at property, if you don't offer options with some feeling that the urban area that you're going to be investing in is not going to die, then Japan's in serious trouble. And I think the Japanese government knows this. The authorities know this. They're trying to regionalize decision-making and do it in conjunction with the government as a whole. We're going to talk about this in a future podcast.
And earlier you mentioned the idea of having aging farmers rent out their land to young farmers through a lease system and passing on their farming know-how. This sounds a lot easier than it is in reality. Japan has a very complicated system around farmland. If you don't have a farming license, you cannot legally purchase farmland. You got to have a license.
It's like a license for a Japanese gun. Got to have a license.
Honestly, it's probably about the same difficulty. I don't know what the farming exam is like, but there's some system in place. And so I think this was designed to protect farmland from turning into landfill or, undesirable, things or developments where there should be farms, because one of Japan's key issues is food independence. And if Japan's farms disappear, then its food self-sufficiency, which is already very low.
It's at 39%, I believe.
Not a very good number. And of course, with an aging farmer population, it threatens to become even lower.
That's right.
I remember watching a TV show or something where they were saying if Japan's imports of food were completely cut off, we'd have to eat sweet potatoes every day.
And cabbage.
Yeah. And we'd get to eat some kind of meat or fish once a week.
Yeah. Well, there's always cup of noodle.
Not the healthiest option. But the farming issue might be changed by policy. There is a movement to perhaps allow non-farmers to somehow purchase farmland. I don't know what that system is going to look like right now. It's something that I've heard about, but
it sounds like a national security issue, because I can't see Japan being comfortable with potential adversaries. I'm not going to name which country they might come from, buying land, water rights and things, and being able to own that. That's got to be something that's maintained inside Japan by at least, I would think, permanent resident status, if not full-fledged Japanese nationality.
And that's actually one interesting facet about the Japanese real estate market that a lot of people don't know about, is that foreigners, whether you're resident or not, can buy Japanese real estate. Want to buy a property? Go right ahead. Want to buy a condo? Sure.
Well, Japan's on sale. Last year, the yen hit 152 to the dollar, right? It's been 40 years since that happened. I would suspect that a lot of foreigners are purchasing Japanese properties right now.
Definitely. And of course, this investment is happening a lot in the sort of new condo sector, which...
But that has to do also with inheritance tax issues, doesn't it?
It does for local Japanese, but not so much for foreigners. I think a lot of the investment is coming from places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and of course, China.
Yeah, the C word. Well, it's a complicated topic. It's a complicated issue. We hope that we've shed some light on the issue for you and that you've enjoyed listening to Japan Unleashed. Stay tuned for our next episode, due out in 2 weeks, and we'll discuss additional interesting issues related to rural revitalization.
And in closing, I'd just like to say that when we're talking about real estate in Japan, we can't avoid the core fact that one of the things that hurts rural communities the worst when it comes to real estate is Japan's real estate business model. Because if you're selling a property that's over 5 million yen, the maximum commission that an agent can take is 3% on closing. If you're selling condos in Ebisu for $2 million a pop, that's a pretty sweet hustle, right? Yeah. But if you're selling 5 million yen houses that might be an hour and a half away from a real estate office, how motivated are you going to be to sell these properties?
That's a good point.
In the course of doing business as Aki and Inaka, I've come across this reality that rural real estate agents are just not really that enthusiastic about selling these properties because it just doesn't represent that much revenue for them.
Yeah, fair enough.
And who can blame them? So that's a huge fundamental problem. Another thing is all of these condos and all of these new houses and all of this marketing and focus on new. You never see anybody talk about, renovating old houses or kind of restoring historical, 100-year-old farmhouses, except for like some random TV program on some crazy foreigner that we probably helped. And so the whole conversation on real estate is so focused on new and condominiums and new houses. And especially when it comes to condominiums, the economics come into play because people buy these condominiums thinking that this area is going to rise in value. Obviously, if they don't think the area is going to rise in value, they're not going to buy it. So there has to be some dynamism towards bringing value to these rural communities. I think that's the conclusion of our discussion today.
A lot of food for thought. Thank you again for listening to Japan Unleashed, and stay tuned for our next episode, due out in 2 weeks, where we will discuss Japan's government initiatives and how that ties into rural revitalization as a whole.
If you haven't already, you can follow Japan Unleashed to get updates on future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks again for listening to Japan Unleashed.